It should say it's recorded. Okay, hi, well, Kate here with another video. Hope everyone is doing well. If you enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. And we have with us Jim Beauchesne, and you are a retired town historian of Lawrence, Massachusetts.
Basically, yeah. Technically, my position was visitor services supervisor at Lawrence Heritage State Park, which is a Massachusetts State Historical Park in Lawrence. I was there for 23 years, retired a year and a half or so ago. I was also a member of the Bread and Roses Heritage Committee, which organizes the annual Labor Day Festival commemorating the strike.
Okay, great. Yeah, so today we're going to talk about the 1912 Bread and Roses strike in Lawrence, historic strike. Oh, unite here. Great. Okay. Yeah, I live in Maine now. I used to live in the Boston area. I've been to the Bread and Rose Festival once. I was in
Hmm.
this group, Socialist Alternative. I no longer am, but I did a radio show with Jeff Booth at Tufts. It was at Tufts University. And I was never a student there, but I did it. We may have interviewed you. I don't know. Don't remember, or someone else connected with Bread and Roses. But, okay, so for people who don't know about the Bread and Roses strike and why it's important, first, a little basic history. The textile industry, as I understand it, began in the 1840s. Would that be correct?
Well, in Lawrence, it did.
Okay, right.
The major textile industrial city in Massachusetts was Lowell, which
Okay,
was begun in the 1820s and
okay.
was very successful and spawned imitators. And some of those industrialists who had invested in Lowell decided to create another industrial city 12 miles down the Merrimack River in what would become Lawrence starting in 1845.
Okay, that's interesting. I didn't know that. So Lawrence was kind of established as an imitation of what was happening in Lowell.
Very much so. Although
Okay.
the things diverged a bit fairly quickly because of the onset of the Irish famine immigration.
Ah, right. Okay. So, right. So, as I understand, the textile industry originally hired New England farm girls, Yankee farm girls who would work for a
Right,
year or two for money for their
right.
dowry, whatever. And then things rapidly changed with the waves of immigrants, Irish and Italians and other
Mhm.
immigrants. Would that be correct?
Very much so. The so-called Yankee Mill Girl system was devised by the founders of Lowell, who built these company-owned boarding houses and instituted a very paternalistic system
Right.
over the lives of the Yankee girls. They were acting in loco parentis, I suppose.
Right.
And that was quite famous for a while. But by the 1840s, that system was beginning to fade as the mills struggled to maintain their originally high profit levels. They began to squeeze the workers. There was even some organizing among the Yankee mill girls. Then by the 1840s, when Lawrence comes around, not only is the Yankee mill girl system straining, but now you've got the arrival of a massive wave of Irish immigrants escaping the famine, and here's another workforce that's available for even cheaper wages, and that begins the cycle of waves of immigrants occupying most of the jobs in the mills in Lawrence and places like Lawrence.
Right. Right. That's
That
interesting. Okay. How is
yeah, I was
this
just
affect? Sorry. Yeah. Go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say, the cycle of immigrants in Lawrence reflects the national or regional cycle. It started with the Irish, then they were followed by Germans and French Canadians, which was my ancestry, who came down in large numbers to the mill cities of New England, starting in like the 1870s, 1880s. Then come the 1890s and early 20th century, we get the massive wave of immigrants from Southern and Eastern Europe,
Right.
who famously came through Ellis Island for the most part. And in Lawrence's case, we're talking Italians, Poles, Lithuanians, Eastern European Jews, many Lebanese, and a whole bunch of others.
Right. Did the mills recruit in Europe? Did they advertise in Europe for people to come over, or was it? or
You know,
spontaneous? Or?
that's been said, but I've never seen definitive evidence of that. It
Okay.
is entirely possible, but I haven't seen any concrete evidence. We do know that in the early days, they hired French Canadian to go back up to Quebec and try to recruit people. But of course, that was a much shorter trip. I have seen images of posters that were distributed in Europe by the steamship companies who were advertising for passengers to come over in steerage and get great jobs in America. But definitely there was networking going on. There were people sending back letters and whatnot saying, there's more opportunity here. They in many cases found out the opportunities weren't so great, but they were here.
Right. That's
And
interesting.
Lawrence,
And,
I was
yeah,
just
go
going to
ahead.
say, Lawrence ended up going through a big growth spurt right after the turn of the century. Three huge mills were built, creating thousands of jobs very quickly, and that became a magnet for the immigrants coming at that time, and the population doubled in 20 years from 1890 to 1910.
Right, that's interesting. Whoa, that's really interesting. Now,
Mhm.
work conditions and living conditions were at times the late 19th century, early 20th century were horrific. One thing I read that like 50% of all children died before the age of 6. The average life expectancy was 39. It was horrific. It was horrific everywhere. When did this happen? When did this begin to get really bad?
Well, conditions in many ways kind of deteriorated over time and for various reasons. The city, as I said, went through that huge growth spurt, and no way could the housing or the city services keep up with that huge influx of population and overcrowding in slum tenement neighborhoods near the mills. Um, Families kept boarders and large numbers of people in small, cramped apartments with poor sanitation, etc.
Right.
Partly it was related to the mechanization of the jobs. As time went on, technology changed, and some of the kind of the overall skill levels required in the mills went down as the processes became increasingly mechanized and required a less skilled workforce. And of course, that was perfect excuse to pay people less if the jobs don't require quite as much skill. So, for all those reasons, living and working conditions were very poor for a great many in Lawrence. It was considered as densely populated as the Lower East Side of Manhattan at that
Okay.
time.
Whoa, well, that's interesting. Now, at the time in 1912, there was something like 51 or 52 different ethnic groups at the time of the strike. Uh,
Yeah, and there's been a bunch of numbers thrown around, and I can't give a definitive answer on that. But there were many immigrant groups, many different languages, and in many cases, groups that we think of as one nationality were not so unified back then. Italy and other countries had regions with regional dialects and so on. So the Sicilians and Neapolitans didn't necessarily consider themselves fellow countrymen. The same thing had happened with the Irish when they arrived. So there were many languages and many different groups, mostly settling in distinct neighborhoods. Although there was also a great deal of overlap, particularly when a group first arrived and just struggled to find housing wherever they could.
okay. Now, there was division between more like skilled workers and unskilled. The skilled workers tended to be from English-speaking countries or England, maybe the UK, Ireland, and Germany, which is not English-speaking. They were the more treated somewhat better, while the Southern Europeans were not treated as well.
Absolutely. There was a hierarchy of ethnic. Of course, the original owners and managers were all Yankees, quote unquote, and then gradually some of the earliest immigrants, and like you say, primarily Northern European, were allowed to advance to either more skilled jobs and in some cases even supervisory jobs. Whereas by the time of the arrival of the Southern and Eastern Europeans, um, that was much less available to them, if at all. And of course, that was part and parcel of the kind of racial hierarchies that were popular at the time about the differences between various European lineages, supposedly. Um, and that was certainly reflected in the way the mills in Lawrence were managed and staffed. And on top of that, there was also the factor of um, mechanization and a certain degree of de-skilling of the jobs. So a big example would be the mule spinners, which was the mule was a very big, complicated machine that uh, spun yarn, and it required a certain degree of strength and a lot of skill, and it was originally a male job and one of the more skilled and kind of prestigious jobs in the mill, and the mule spinners had a certain amount of pride and autonomy. And of course, the owners didn't like that, so the spinning process was gradually moved over to a different type of machine that was easier to operate, and then became a less skilled job and was mostly filled by women, and of course was paid a lot less than the
Okay.
mule spinners used to get.
Interesting, interesting. So major de-skilling going on. What was the level of technology? Like originally it was water-driven, water turbines and steam. When did like gas engines, internal combustion engines come in, like the early 20th century, or was that a bit later? What was the level of technology?
Well, internal combustion engines, to my knowledge, were never used for power in the mills. Of course,
Oh,
they became used extensively for trucks that would
right, right.
deliver uh, raw materials in and finish cloth out, which is kind of a early mid 20th century development. But the
Okay.
mills were founded on the basis of water power.
Mhm.
Again, that started in Lowell and was recreated in Lawrence with the construction of a giant dam across the Merrimack River, really an engineering marvel of the 19th century. And the mills were entirely powered by water power for the first, say about 40 years. By that point, say the 1880s, they had maxed out the water power. They were using every available drop coming down the Merrimack River. So, in order to grow, the mills added steam engines, which was a technology that existed earlier but was being gradually perfected in America, and also was becoming more available due to the availability of coal coming from the coal fields in Pennsylvania. So then they add steam engines, but in both cases, it's mechanical energy, hydromechanical power turning wheels and shafts and belts leading to the machines, and then the steam engines added on would do the same thing until the early 20th century when they convert gradually to electricity. But again, they're still using the water and steam to generate the electricity. They're not bringing it in from a utility. They're generating their own power by water and steam. And then the electricity was distributed through the mills with motors on each floor, but still using the shafts and belts to bring that power to the individual machines.
Right.
Uh, a textile factory today operates very differently. Every machine has its own smaller motor, and therefore they can be all spread out on one level with the power from electrical power being delivered by wire with no loss of power, however far you go.
Right.
So that's why factories today are very rarely built on the design of the mills in Lawrence, which are very vertical. A modern factory is all spread out on one level, so you're not wasting time and energy bringing materials up and down floor to floor.
Right. Interesting. Yeah, I live outside of Portland, Maine, like Westbrook, near where I live. Has these old factories, old New England factories, like 5 or 6 stories high. It's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
What percentage of clothing in the U.S. came out of these mills? Was it all of it or most of it, or was there competition from like Manchester, England? What percentage of clothing came from there?
Well, not much was once the American industry really got going by the late 19th century. I don't think we were importing much from England or
Okay,
anywhere else. And for certain times, the American industry was protected by import tariffs.
right.
So it was mostly domestic production, and it was all over the place. And New England was kind of the cradle of it, and the center of the textile industry for a number of decades, but it existed in other parts of the country too, Pennsylvania, and even in the South. There was a growing textile industry as early as late 19th century, and then much more in the 20th century.
Right, interesting. Yeah, the textile industry in the North Carolina, but that came a bit later.
Mm,
Interesting.
yeah.
So the situation in 1912, you get a situation with horrible working conditions, many immigrant groups, and the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts passed a law regulating hours, work hours. I think it was 52 hours per week, which now seems pretty high. But
Hmm.
so what set off the strike? The textile companies decided to basically lower people's pay. Like they were working, they work less hours, fine, but they were paying them much less. How did this play out?
Well, the Mass Legislature, in its wisdom, passed a law in 1911 reducing the maximum hours from 56 to 54 hours a week for women and children. It was a paternalistic measure that was to protect women and children. But the work in the mills was so interdependent, and there were so many women and children working there that they wouldn't be work for the men to do the additional 2 hours if they were there for the legal 56. So they basically cut the entire schedule, cut everyone back to 54 hours. The question remained what would happen to their pay, which was not addressed in the legislation as to whether the pay needed to be kept at its previous level or could be cut. And the workers were obviously very concerned about that, and efforts were made to find out what the mills planned to do. One of the sort of myths about the strike is that it was very spontaneous, and that's true to some extent, but there were workers getting together in the late 1911 trying to get an answer from the mills as to what would happen when the new law was implemented. And there were a number of workers who were organized before the strike. There were a handful of skilled workers in skilled crafts unions, but there were also a number of mostly Italians who had joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World. And there was also a small but significant group of Franco-Belgians who were already pretty politicized and radicalized, and they were organizing in advance. So when that first paycheck arrived in 1911, reflecting the pay cut for the equivalent of 2 hours pay, the workers kind of knew that it was probably time for collective action, and the walkouts began.
Okay, so there was a story. There's one plant where women noticed they were being paid less, and they walked out, and it spread. Although a lot was building up to it, but it spread from there, became a general walkout. Now,
Yeah, that was the mill. For whatever reason, they got their pay envelopes a day before most everybody else. They got it on Thursday instead of Friday, and these were mostly Polish and Lithuanian women weavers, I believe, and they were the first
okay, they were the first, and spread elsewhere. Now, what was the role
all
of the
over.
AFL all over? Yeah, and they shut down the city. They shut down most of the city. What
Mm.
was the role of the AFL, American Federation of Labor? Did they didn't do very much?
They didn't do much, and in fact, they were kind of a detriment in some ways to the strike. The AFL, of course, under Samuel Gompers at the time, was a fairly conservative labor union, only interested in organizing skilled male workers of Northern European descent. not much interested in organizing industrial workers who were primarily immigrants, such as the vast majority of the workers in Lawrence. Some of the skilled workers, loom fixers and such, were members of AFL affiliated unions. But the Italians, who were already, well, in about 300 of them were already members of the IWW, and they called the IWW office in New York and said, "Send help. We have this thing breaking out suddenly, and we need skilled organizers." So that's how the IWW came to be the primary organizer of the strike. And as it went on, the AFL affiliated textile union was in some ways trying to undermine the strike because they detested the IWW and its radicalism, which they were, they feared it would smear the entire labor movement as radical. So they were generally very much opposed to the IWW's growing influence at the time.
Okay. Now, the IWW sent over a couple people, Big Bill Haywood, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a few other people. Um,
Eventually, the first two were Joseph Ettore and
right.
Arturo Giovannitti. They came that very first weekend that
Okay.
the strike broke out and began the organizing process. And they did it by organizing workers according to their ethnicities and language groups. So there
Okay.
were, I think, 24 different um, groups organized by language so that they could communicate because obviously they were mostly new immigrants who didn't speak English yet. And Ettore himself spoke 5 or 6 languages, I believe.
Okay.
But in any case, they had Lawrence workers at the head of each of the 24 distinct language groups, which conflicts with one of the myths of the strike, particularly opponents of the strike, portrayed it as being led by a bunch of outside radical agitators,
Okay.
whereas in fact there were many Lawrence workers who took on leadership roles in the strike. They just weren't as famous and visible as the Haywoods and the Flints. Now,
Right.
Ettore and Giovannitti were organizing for the first several weeks, but an incident occurred in which a striker was shot and killed in a melee between strikers and police, and
Right.
they were blamed for it.
Right.
Initially, anyway, they were arrested, even though they were nowhere near the scene, just on the theory that they had advocated people be out in the streets protesting.
Right. That
So,
was Pozo, I believe.
I'm sorry?
That was Anna Lapozo was killed. She was Italian.
Annie Lapizzo was a young Italian woman who was killed in that incident, and we don't know if she was participating. She may just have been a passerby.
Okay.
She was a mill worker, and this was at an intersection where one of the mills butts right into what was then the Italian neighborhood.
Okay.
And we don't know who fired the shot. The police blame the strikers, and the strikers blame the police, and we don't actually know. I mean, it was almost certainly a stray shot, not intended to hit her. But in any case, the authorities used that as a means to try to decapitate the leadership of the strike by arresting Ettore and Giovannitti on these rather baseless charges. And that's what brought Haywood and Flynn to Lawrence after those two had been taken out of action for the most part.
Okay. That's interesting. That's interesting. Now, how long did the strike go on for?
Was 9 weeks, January 11, I believe, until the beginning of March, middle of March, during a very harsh, bitterly cold winter.
Right.
Folks were out protesting in picket lines and marches in terrible weather and without income, of course, for food and fuel to heat their apartments. There was a major fundraising effort for the relief fund for the strike, which gathered, I believe, about $75,000 in donations from all over the country. There
Right.
was a lot of nationwide support, even international support, because so many of the immigrants, the workers rather, were new immigrants that their home countries were interested in what they were going through here.
Okay.
But it got really rough for people to feed their families, and that gave rise to one of the famous episodes in the strike, which was when strikers' children were taken in by sympathizers in other cities.
Right.
Uh,
Barry, New York City, and I think Patterson, New Jersey, or someplace. Yeah.
uh, yeah, and I want to say Hartford, Connecticut, and Barry, Vermont, which was a
Right.
small town with a big granite industry, and there was a lot of radical organizing there. It was a socialist labor hall, which today is a great historical site in Barrie, and they took in a bunch of the Lawrence children. Now, this was a tactic that had been used in European strikes, but had never been done in America before, and it was
Okay.
not only for relief, but it made for very good PR when the trainload of children arrived in New York City and they're marched through the streets with banners about, we came from Lawrence for bread. So it served a dual purpose, and it was so effective that the authorities decided to put a stop to it. And one of the trains that was set to bring kids to Philadelphia, the parents with the children were met by police and militia who forcibly prevented them from boarding the train. And some of the mothers ended up being beaten by the police and arrested and so on. And it ended up being a much worse PR disaster for the mill owners.
Right. So then there was congressional testimony. They testified before Congress. It got to be a scandal.
Absolutely. I think quite possibly stemming from that incident at the train station, hearings were scheduled in Congress, and a number of people from Lawrence went down to testify, including some children who worked in the mills, and one of whom was, I think, a 14-ish-year-old Italian girl named Carmela Tioli, and she testified about, first of all, starting work before she was of legal age, which was not uncommon. That people would get falsified documents and get their kids in the mills because they needed the extra income because the parents were paid so little. They needed the extra income to keep the family going. So she had gone in underage, and then she was in an accident in the mill in which her hair had gotten wrapped up in the machinery or the belt and ripped part of her scalp off.
Oh,
And that was just uh, about the worst thing from a publicity standpoint for the mill owners, and was really the catalyst that brought this strike to a settlement
okay.
in favor of the workers.
Okay. Now, what else was going on? The mill bosses, they got students from Harvard, offered to get students from Harvard to come in and break the strike. They were offered like to get out of their final exams if they broke the strike. Were they
Right.
successful getting people to scab on the strike? Did they?
Well, some people did, and that kind of leads to another one of the myths about the strike, which is that the cooperation amongst the various immigrant groups was basically universal. In fact, there was more of a hierarchy, which depended in part on when a group had arrived. So, for example, the Irish were the first immigrant group to come to Lawrence in the late 1840s. So by 1912, they're in the third generation.
Okay.
Not so many work in the mills anymore. A lot of them have worked their way up in local businesses and local government, and most of the police were Irish. So they were much less sympathetic to the strike, and in many cases opposed. Of course, this was also due in part to the influence of the Catholic Church, which was not in favor of labor
Unions.
unions at the time, or particularly a union like the IWW, who were radical socialists, blah blah blah, or at least that's how they were influences. The Irish
Okay.
are mostly against it, and the French Canadians, my ancestors, were kind of stuck in the middle. They'd arrived after the Irish and weren't as well established, but were doing much better than the new Italians and Lebanese, for example, and had moved into some of the skilled jobs in the mills, not supervisors, but some of the decent paying jobs, and also were very much influenced by the Catholic Church leaders who told them to stay away from those nasty IWW strikers. You should obey authority in the form of the mill owners and anybody else. So the French Canadians were kind of standoffish and may have stayed out of work, but not necessarily being on the picket line, but just stayed away to keep out of trouble.
Okay.
But the newest immigrants, led by the Italians and the Syrians, I kind of say Syrians and Lebanese interchangeably. Lebanon was part of Syria at the time, but most of them were Lebanese, and that's what they call themselves today. And they were very active, as were a handful of others of Southern and Eastern European descent, who were very recent immigrants.
Okay. There were Poles or people from the Russian Empire. Were there Russian
Mm-hmm.
Jews there? Were they in
Yeah,
presence? Okay.
yeah, that
Okay.
was a fairly significant group. I don't know the numbers, um, and some in leadership positions in the strike.
Okay. Now you
There was
talked.
a
Yeah,
I
go
was
on.
just going to say there was a committee of 10 who were the leading local individuals in the strike committee, and they handled the negotiations with the mill owners, not the IWW. I mean, they relied on the IWW, professional organizers for advice, but they really led the negotiations with the owners.
Interesting. Okay. So would it be accurate to say the IWW was the catalyst, but there was a lot of worker self-management? The workers were really doing it themselves. The organizers helped them, but they did it themselves.
Uh, yeah, a lot of it was done by the workers themselves because there were, only a handful of IWW organizers on site. So it very much depended on the ability of the Lawrence workers to communicate, to support one another, and to, take on the risk and responsibility of being out on the streets protesting when there are many militia, as you say, some Harvard students out in the streets of Lawrence with rifles with bayonets, guarding the
Right.
mill district, and
Right.
even guarding downtown. And there's one fairly important book about the strike written by Artis Cameron, who was a
Okay.
historian at the University of Maine. And she documented how the neighborhood networks, particularly among the women, were crucial in enabling the strike by, offering support to neighbors, not necessarily of the same ethnic group, food, childcare, etc., and just communication about, where the protest is going to be or where the police are going to be, and that very important stuff to keep it going under very difficult circumstances.
Interesting. Interesting. So the IWW played a role. Did other radical groups, the Socialist Party or the Socialist Labor Party, did they have a presence or play any role?
Well, they were supportive, and certainly constituted many of the financial supporters or the people who took in Lawrence children in other cities.
Right.
I don't know that they had any specific formal role. There were certainly many sympathizers of radical persuasion who came to Lawrence, documented what was going on. Journalists, notably Mary Heaton Vorse, wrote about the strike. She's the one who dubbed it the singing strike because the workers were kept up their spirits by singing at these mass meetings. Um, and others came. For example, Carlo Tresca was technically not an IWW. He was an anarchist, but he was among those who came to Lawrence to help.
He was an interesting character. I read a biography of him, All the Right Enemies. He was possibly he was possibly bumped off by the mafia. There's a theory about that. Interesting,
Really.
fascinating. Fascinating. Anyway, you talked. Was the Massachusetts National Guard mobilized, or were the bosses of local militias? How did that play out?
Yeah, I don't actually know the distinction between militia and National Guard. I think it may just be uh, terminology that's changed since then, but it was referred to as the militia, and it was, local people from various parts of Massachusetts and some from Boston, etc., including that unit of Harvard students who got credit for being here. Um,
Right?
and yeah, and they were housed in the mills. The militia was housed in the mills and treated nicely by the authorities for coming here and trying to suppress those
Yeah.
wild-eyed immigrants on strike.
Yeah, I was going to say, I hope the Harvard students weren't studying labor economics. Anyway,
I
um,
don't think they taught that at the time.
no, I don't think they did. Now, how long, you mentioned, how long did the strike go on for?
Well, it was 9 weeks.
Okay.
Over the course of that time, there were these dramatic episodes at the train station and the children's exodus. There was another death. We mentioned Annie Lapizzo. The other striker who was killed was a teenage Syrian boy named John Ramey, and he was actually a cornet player in a Syrian band that was leading a march of demonstrators, and they came up to a line of militia which was preventing them from proceeding with their march and actually wanted them to turn around and go back. But with the band out front and folks in the back not knowing what was going on, they couldn't retreat fast enough, and the militia advanced with rifles with bayonets, and he was stabbed in the back by a bayonet
Ugh,
and bled to death later that night.
ugh, that,
So two were killed during the strike, and there was also one who was killed in the fall in the period of post-strike repression.
okay. Okay, now, how was the strike settled? What concessions did the workers get?
Well, they got pay increases that were weighted toward the lowest paid workers.
Okay,
They got a change in work rules. There was a bonus system called the premium system, which was actually a kind of draconian device to keep workers at their jobs and take no days off. If you like took one day off or you were sick in the course of a month, um, you wouldn't meet your quota and your pay would be reduced. So they changed the rules on that, and I want to say there was some other important concession, but I can't remember what that was. Oh, very important, the promise that there would be no recriminations against strikers.
okay.
And of course, the mills did not keep that promise. There was a very active blacklist afterwards. Known activists were not allowed back in the mills, or if they were discovered, they were quickly fired.
Right. So what, those wave of repression, people were fired, were there mass firings or known activists were fired and pushed out?
Yeah, and after the settlement, when those kind of things were happening, there wasn't much the IWW or the workers could do. I mean, the strike was so stressful for any number of reasons, just putting food on the table, and that was about the only weapon at the workers' disposal was the strike or the threat of going on strike. Um, they didn't sign a contract
Right.
because the IWW didn't believe in signing contracts, which recognized the owner's legitimacy. And the owners wouldn't have signed a contract anyway with, you know, grievance procedures and all those things. They still felt that they had complete control. There were ongoing things during the summer of 1912, and also the pending trial of Ettore and Giovannitti for the death of Annie Lapizzo. The trial was scheduled to take place in the fall, and that generated more protest for their release on those trumped up charges. And that led to a big confrontation in the fall. Tresca, again, came to Lawrence with a bunch of anarchists and they paraded around with a banner that ended with the anarchist slogan, "No God, no master." And that, for some of the powers that be in Lawrence, was the last straw. And they organized an anti-IWW campaign in the fall called God and Country. Because you can be for God and Country, or you can be for the IWW, but you can't be both. We won't allow that. So it culminated with this big giant parade on Labor Day with the city just festooned in red, white, and blue flags and bunting and so on. And basically, the workers were being forced to choose. You can retain your loyalty to the IWW or be good Americans. And in order to keep their jobs, which they needed to do to survive, many of the workers kind of let their IWW memberships lapse, and the whole city kind of learned to keep quiet about the strike, and the story of God and Country became the official story, quote unquote, of the events of 1912, and remained so for 6+ decades.
That's interesting. Okay. So the IWW did not have a sustained organization in Lawrence. They fell apart.
That wasn't their strong point. Maintaining an organization, they, Eder, or rather Flynn and Haywood, I think, moved on in 1913 to the Patterson Silk Strike,
Right.
which was another huge strike in Patterson, New Jersey, which unfortunately failed. So one of the unique things about the Lawrence strike is that the workers won, which is very rare among those famous strikes and labor confrontations of the late 19th and early 20th century. Homestead, Pullman, Ludlow, very dramatic confrontations, but generally the workers came up on the short end. But not in Lawrence. It was a victory, which makes it such an inspiring story.
Right, interesting. So World War One basically gave the bosses the chance to claw back whatever they've given. I heard really they basically took back what the workers had gained.
Yeah, there was retrenchment with some of the gains. It's been speculated that the dominant company in Lawrence at the time, the American Woolen Company, which was trying to become the giant of the textile industry, moved some of their work to some of their mills in other cities in order
Okay.
to more or less punish the Lawrence workers for
Right.
their activism. So there was less work in Lawrence and more layoffs, which was always a problem for textile workers. The work could be somewhat seasonal, and layoffs meant no income because it's before workers' comp or
Right.
unemployment compensation, I should
Unemployment.
say.
Yeah. Yeah. All right. Interesting. So what happened after the First World War in the 20s and 30s? Were there any reflections of this labor unrest later? And when did the textile industry start to decline?
There was another major strike in Lawrence in 1919.
Okay.
The IWW wasn't technically a participant in that. Of course, they had been decimated by
World War
repression
One.
during World War One and after in the Palmer raids and such. But there were a number of Lawrence workers who had sort of got on their education in radicalism during the 1912 strike and being with the IWW. So the 1919 strike was a big one, was very contentious, and so on. I I don't know. I can't recall now how that turned out, uh, pro striker or not. I kind of think it was not as successful as 1912. And
Okay.
then by the 1920s, the textile industry in New England begins its decline. There are growing mills in the South. Of course, employers want to escape the regulation and the increasing unionization of workers in the Northeast, and the southern states offered, generally union-free workplaces. They were offering other incentives to have um, employers come down to the South, free power, I think, in some places. The industry was mostly on the Piedmont line, so there was water power available in the South. It was closer to the supply of cotton for the cotton mill industry, anyway. And other technology was changing, so the mill cities in New England were no longer as advantageous sites as they had originally been, and newer mills in the South and elsewhere could be more competitive. So the decline began in the 1920s. A place like Lowell saw multiple mill closings in the 1920s because they had remained concentrated in cotton textiles. Lawrence
Okay.
by this time was mostly woolen textiles, and that industry hung on better until right after World War II.
Okay.
And that's when the really steep economic decline in Lawrence took
Okay.
place.
That's interesting. What are the industries in Lawrence today? What are the main industries?
Well, there's no one main industry. There's still a little bit of manufacturing, but we lost our
Okay.
last textile mill about 6 or 8 years ago. That was
Okay.
Malden Mills, and there's a whole bunch of small and manufacturing, and some high tech has moved into old mill spaces. But the largest single employer is the hospital, which is probably not unusual in a lot of places. And the old mills, which had a lot of uh, uh, smaller manufacturing for a few decades. There was a lot of shoe shops and garment manufacturing, but now those have left for cheaper jobs overseas. So the mills finally are starting to be redeveloped into um, commercial uses and residential.
Okay.
Um,
Right.
but the people in Lawrence today, and it's a majority Latino city, work in all different things, and in many cases, they go out of the city to work in industrial parks and malls in the region, and
Okay.
hospitals and nursing homes and things like that.
Right. Interesting. Okay. I know Lowell has a larger Cambodian community. Is this
Hmm.
true of this as well, or not as much?
Not as much, for whatever reason. Well, it was called chain migration. Some people come and get established, and other people from their home country follow. And for some reason, the Southeast Asians, Cambodians, and others settled in Lowell, and that community has grown and grown. They have Latino population, but not nearly as large. Whereas Lawrence is exactly the opposite. We've become a primarily Latino city with a small Southeast Asian population, mostly Vietnamese, I believe.
Okay.
But it is majority Latino today. Dominicans being the largest, and followed by Puerto Ricans and many, many others.
Okay. Okay. Interesting. Now, how was the Bread and Roses strike remembered today? I know every year there's a Bread and Roses festival during the summertime. What do they do during
Hmm.
that? And how is this remembered today?
Well, today it is largely remembered as a positive uh, moment in Lawrence history, something that people take pride in. This is a complete reversal from the decades of repression and demonization under the God and Country rubric. The revival and revisionism began in the 1970s, partly fueled by a couple of New Yorkers who came to Lawrence and helped us remember our own history. One
Okay.
being the artist Ralph Fasanella, one of whose Lawrence paintings is in the poster behind my, I guess that's my left shoulder. Um,
Yep.
Sadly, the print is faded over years. It's 30 years old, but he created these great images of Lawrence that have become some of the most best known images of American labor history. The other New Yorker was Paul Cowan, a journalist for the Village Voice, who
Heard of
wrote a
that.
big article about Lawrence's amnesia about its own history,
Hmm.
and the history of the strike. So they were the spark, shall we say, but there were also some local people who were interested and thought that we should take a second look at the strike. And instead of it being a shameful episode in our history, maybe it's something we should be proud of. And that's taken hold. It's taken hold so well that a lot of people now don't know about the decades of repression.
Yeah.
Um, but the revival included the creation of Lawrence Heritage State Park, where I used to work, where the strike is portrayed very positively in the exhibits, and in the creation of the Bread and Roses Festival around the same time. The first one was in 1985, and it was intended to make the history known and make the history relevant, particularly in the cooperation among the various immigrant groups that was a feature of the strike, which was something that Lawrence kind of needed at the time because the Latino immigrants were not being welcomed warmly, to say the least, and we needed to get people together. So that was part of the motive in creating the Bread and Roses Festival. And a lot of people got behind it. The first few years, we had some pretty big budgets and big acts. That declined around 1990 because the economy declined. So the festival's been on a somewhat smaller scale since then, but it's still going. And this year will be the
Okay.
39th.
Okay. When is it held? It's held in August, if I remember, or
It is on Labor Day.
Labor Day.
Which is usually the first Monday in September. I forget the date of it this year, but it is on Labor Day on the Common in North Lawrence, from 11:30 to 5-ish, generally, with multiple musical acts on stage, very diverse, music, dance, etc. Some historical programming, tours, lectures, etc., and a lot of representation by many of the progressive nonprofits in Lawrence, as well as labor unions
Right.
are present as well.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Interesting. Is this taught in the school system in the Lawrence School District? Is it taught about the
It
high
is.
school kids? It is. Okay.
Yeah, it is now.
Okay.
I'm not sure how systematically it is taught, but I know that it is, and taught as a proud part of Lawrence's past. There was a program we were running at the Heritage Park with a theater group from Boston that had this wonderful original play about the Bread and Roses strike, and we were getting all the fifth graders from all the Lawrence public schools to come to the park and watch this play, and also tour the museum. Now that got waylaid by COVID, but we're very much hoping that'll start up again.
Okay. Interesting. Cool. Cool. And I can't think of anything else. Actually, is there anything you'd like to add, or where people can find more information? Or
Well, I will say that Lawrence, there is, of course, Lawrence Heritage State Park.
Mhm.
The visitor center is in one of those old boarding houses they built for the Yankee Mill girls, and it's got a great exhibit on the history of Lawrence. including, of course, the strike and some terrific videos about the strike. And that's open 7 days a week from 9 to 4. So I highly recommend people going there. Lawrence also has a wonderful historical society called the Lawrence History Center.
Okay.
And they have a very, very extensive website, which includes an exhibit they created for the centennial of the strike in 2012. We had a year-long schedule of events in 2012 and a expanded Bread and Roses Festival. And as a matter of fact, that's where this T-shirt comes from,
Ah,
celebrating the centennial. Unite
okay.
Here was the union for the workers at Malden Mills, which, as I said, was the last textile mill, which sadly has closed since then. But the Lawrence History Center has a terrific website with tons of information because it's a great place to visit. More so if you want to do some research and see some historical stuff. It's a great collection of historical items. And then, of course, the Bread and Roses Heritage Committee has a website where they will have lots of information about the festival. I'm not sure much is up on it yet. They're still in the planning and organizing stages, but that will be up there sometime this summer.
Okay, so you work for the Historical Society, is it?
Well, I worked for Lawrence Heritage State Park, so I was a state employee,
Okay.
Massachusetts Department of Conservation and Recreation. Um, the historical society called the Lawrence History Center. I have volunteered for them. I was on the board at one point, and the Bread and Roses Heritage Committee is another separate small nonprofit organization, which I was a part of for many years. The park and the Bread and Roses Committee worked hand in hand to make the festival happen for all these years.
Okay, cool. Okay, well, thanks. That was wonderful information, and I thank you very much for spending your time.
It's an absolute pleasure, Kate, and I thank you. And I just feel this stuff is so important. American labor history is woefully underappreciated. It's a very important part of our history, and the Bread and Roses strike is one of the best episodes to read about and study. The drama of it, the compelling figures in it, and the fact that it was a rare victory for workers. It's a wonderful story, and I recommend anybody to dig into that history.
Right. Okay, well, thank you very much.
Thanks, Kate. Take care.
Okay,
Bye bye.
take care. Bye bye.